Hey everyone. I am back for a solo, which I'm really pumped about. We have been a little delinquent in getting things recorded. We've just had so much going on with season and then celebrated our 10-year and Times Square, which was so much fun. It actually was so funny because I originally wanted to go to Times Square just with my family, just to be like, bring it in and, celebrate this milestone. And Mercedes, my director of marketing, who's been with me for many, many years, was like, oh, heck no, I'm definitely going. And you know how that goes. It's like if one person's going, they're all going. And before we knew it, there was like 10 of us out there. And it was just such a fun experience and such a rewarding time. So for those of you who don't know, a little bit about our team. We just celebrated 10 years. And so we have a little bit of fun stuff on social media about that. But anyway, with that being said, having a decade under my belt, I know a thing or two about how much money couples are spending these days and just how difficult it is to navigate the cost associated with these weddings. Because if you go on ChatGPT or you go on Google, there's literally not anything out there that I feel like is really supportive or gives any sense of reasonable ranges. And so one of the things that we're going to be looking to do is some Stand Store downloads that are going to be really supportive for couples just in terms of budgeting framework, realistic benchmarks per vendor category, just to help them, quite frankly, to navigate this. And that was why I was really passionate about filming today's episode, which is really just about budgets and sort of one of the biggest reasons that couples go over budgets. And it's not because they spend or want to spend that much. It's because they didn't know what they were budgeting for. Everyone can see, essentially the flowers or the decor or the core vendors, we call them, right? So your venue, your food, your beverage, your caterer, your photographer, your DJ, your priest, hair and makeup. We call those kind of the core visible cost, right? But it's really the invisible cost or the not so visible cost that really are what catch a lot of, newly engaged couples and families off guard. And so I'm hoping that this podcast gives a little bit more visibility into what these costs are. So first and foremost, what are visible costs, right? So visible costs are things such as how much the venue is charging you to host your wedding at that particular location. What is the menu cost, right? What is your caterer charging you to, for your menu that you've selected? How much are the bar packages? How much is our photo and video going to be charging us for the amount of hours that we need over the course of the weekend? How much is our DJ? Like these are all kind of more visible, pretty obvious costs. These are things that you almost would have to have in order to have a celebration. Your attire, stationery. A lot of couples now are doing more digital or hybrid methods, but these are kind of the easy to research because they're front facing and kind of more often advertised, right? So they're a little bit easier to grab. So when you're outlining your budget, it's more the invisible cost that nobody really talks about. And this is where the budgets start to sort of drift or go in a different direction. So some examples should include things like service charges. So I've mentioned many times that I'm a strong advocate for it because transparency is a big thing in this industry. But, venues are going to charge you an outside catering fee to bring in your own caterer. And then on top of that outside catering fee, let's say it's $70. They're going to then charge you a service charge, which can range depending on the location of the event. It can be anywhere from 24, 26, 28% service charge. And then on top of that, they're going to charge you obviously standard sales tax. Okay. And sometimes there's admin fees built into that as well. But it's really important that just understanding that that alone is like thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars that a lot of times couples and families just either didn't know that there was a service charge on top of the outside catering fee. Because that's, not so obvious or not so advertised. Usually it kind of just says plus plus by the number. And, then you get into it and you're like, what is this plus plus? And you're like, oh, okay, that's what that is. Anyway, another item would be like overtime fees. So for example, if you're booking at a venue and they've given you 3 hours to set up the space and that looks all good when you're signing the venue contract, but now you've just designed your mandap and your designer saying it's going to take at least 6 hours for install. Well, now we're going to basically have to beg, borrow, and steal from the venue in terms of timeframes that we can get access to that space. And sometimes they can't do it if they have another event piggybacking off of it. And If that's the case, then you are going to definitely have to, triple your labor, if not redesign your month up in order to accomplish those things, right? So a couple other invisible or not so advertised costs is going to be like things like vendor travel or hotel rooms. These people are leaving their dear friends and family to be on site with you for your occasion, completely dedicated to your event for an extended period of time. Sometimes it's 2 days, sometimes three, four. And so they're going to require accommodations usually on site, even if they're local, because if they're getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, or doing overnight flips, they need somewhere that they can just sleep, re energize, and continue to work your occasion. And so a lot of times families don't necessarily spec for vendor rooms or maybe underplay how much they're actually going to need. I would say on average, we usually need anywhere between 8 to 10 vendor rooms per night, depending on the occasion. So again, if your venue is charging, I don't know, $400 a night plus for, occupancy and, tax and things like that, then obviously you want to make sure that you factor that into your budget because that can be a pretty big chunk of change. But unfortunately, it's just kind of part of that experience in order to have these vendor teams on site. Another item is things like power drops. I budget in power into my clients' budgets. And power is one of the most challenging things to outline, but I can say that I haven't had a power bill probably under $5,000 for a client in a really long time. And so one of the things that clients are constantly saying is, doesn't the ballroom already have power? Or they're not like outlets along the walls? And yes, there most certainly are. But when we're bringing in professional lighting and DJ equipment, and then the caterer needs to plug in, there's a lot of power being distributed, and you can only plug in to, the outlets without tripping power. So a lot of times we're having to bring in additional power or drop power in a specific location. And so those are things that, again, are just not advertised costs until you get into the nitty gritty of it. You just would not know that you would require that, right? Or outdoor events needing generators, things like that. A couple other more not so advertised costs are things like permits. So again, if you're having a barat that's off hotel property, number one, they're not guaranteed. That's an important thing to note. Depending on the location and other things going on, the city very well could decline or accept your permit, and that can come with variable fees as well. Sometimes it's a minimal fee, and then you have to hire off-duty police officers to control traffic, things to that end, or reroute traffic. And sometimes they're hefty fees because you're closing down, a main area downtown or things to that end. And so all those things come into play. Sometimes your photographer or videographers are going to require to get a permit if they want to take any pictures in public spaces or things like that. I know Miami Beach is very strict about that as well. So permits are definitely one of those things that I think a lot of people underplay. Another item that is a little bit more advertised, and I'm a big advocate for talking about contingency plans. I know nobody likes to talk about the weather, but if you're getting married in an off-site property, right, a venue that does not have a natural indoor backup, you absolutely are going to need to come up with a plan B. You're going to have to contact tenting companies, and we're going to have to navigate what is a contingency plan look like for that space. So if it's on, grass, then we have to look at the forecast leading up to that because we obviously don't want people walking around on mud or us, if grass is wet, right? Naturally, what's going to happen when you got a 20 plus vendors that are setting up for a reception or a ceremony, there's going to be a lot of foot traffic, right? And so those are things that you take into consideration. If we're having to put flooring down, are we having to pull AC in depending on the time of year to keep everyone comfortable? Obviously, power comes into play with contingency plans. So a lot of my clients will avoid tenting like the plague because they just know that that's going to take their budget to a whole different price point. But for sure, I think tents alone, I would say like basic tents are probably for 300 people, I don't know, $20,000 to start. And that's definitely not with subfloor. It's definitely not with AC. And so when you start to build those pieces together, I mean, gosh, you have structures nowadays that are going anywhere between, I don't know, $120,000 to $200,000 easily. And so when you're doing these custom build out or glass tents or things like that, those are things definitely to take into consideration with the venue that you're choosing. And outside of that is also just things like your hospitality room. I know this sounds literally crazy because you're just having a room that you want the service and the point of it to be that attendees in between functions can come, get a cup of chai, grab a little snack, and cruise out in between your meal functions or visit with each other, right? And not have to necessarily go to a restaurant outlet or the pool or things like that at your resort or wherever it's taking place. And sometimes the venues will either charge you a venue rental fee and they'll kind of look the other way and you can kind of bring in what you want, but then you're sort of managing that, which quite frankly, isn't usually my number one recommendation, just because if you're hosting this beautiful full service guest experience weekend, and then you got kind of this hospitality room that seems to just be, sort of an afterthought, that's something certainly to take into consideration. But the hospitality room alone can certainly add up because if you're, wanting coffee in there or sodas or, snacks, but you need attendance. And then you have like obviously the caterer's fee associated with those items. And so hospitality rooms, quite frankly, can add up, especially if we're doing full meals like breakfast or lunch or anything. I call them mini meals. So the mini meals in between. So it's just a couple, examples of some of the invisible or not so advertised costs that I feel like can quickly add up and become a six-figure plus investment for clients who are planning their functions. And really the next item to take into consideration is the compounding effect, right? So an example is if a couple budgets, I don't know, $80,000 for their venue and $90,000 for catering and $40,000 for entertainment and $60,000 in florals, they're sitting at like $270,000. And, ultimately they think they're in great shape. But then when you add that 25% service charge and that sales tax and vendor hotel rooms and transportation, additional labor, AV upgrades, power, potentially tent contingencies, vendor meals, any overtime labor, suddenly you're closer to $360,000 or $400,000 without adding anything or adding additional guests. So it's definitely some things that you want to make sure that you comb through with your planner, because that's really where I feel like there's a disconnect between what the market is telling you how much something costs. And then when you actually put pen to paper and you go through everything that's going to be necessary for your wedding weekend, that's when you can kind of actualize where these expenses are coming from and really see what the bottom line figure that they're going to end up being at. So you're going to notice that when I was talking about budgets and things like that, nothing really changed about the vision. It was simply that we were uncovering the true cost of what it's going to take to execute it. And I think that that can be, you know, very much a sticker shock to, quite frankly, any clients, because a lot of the clients that we work with don't spend necessarily what they can. They spend what makes sense for their occasion. And unfortunately, there's a lot of logistical costs that play a big role into the overall expenditures that it comes out to be. And I think just like the biggest misconception is that as much as I love that we are in an era of social media, certainly more than it's ever been in the history of my career, again, 10-year milestone, I've been doing it Indian weddings for 15 years, but you know, Pinterest obviously creates a lot of inspiration. So does Instagram or your friend's wedding that they just showed you, but it doesn't really create a budget, right? And so two weddings can look identical in photos, but have dramatically different investments. And that's because the time of year, the labor, the logistics surrounding that function, were there flowers in season or off season? What were the venue restrictions surrounding that date? Did they have another, corporate group in house that they were having to navigate around, or were you the only show in town that weekend? Because I get this a lot sometimes where couples will say, hey, I just had a friend, they planned their wedding, they spent X amount. Why is my wedding, costing this? And, obviously, unless you're looking at somebody else's budget outline, if they frame that correctly or tracked and they're managed their expenses correctly, or what's included in their budget and compared to what we've included in yours, oftentimes it's a lot of these invisible costs or these variables that are definitely tilting the scale a little bit. And I think that that's why it's just so important that you forecast and project appropriately from the beginning to avoid surprises later, because they certainly are going to be costly surprises. And once you've signed a venue contract, you sort of relinquish a lot of your power, right? But that's just something I think to keep in mind, because you're not just paying for what people see, you're paying for everything required to make it happen seamlessly, right? So I really just feel like couples these days should focus instead of how much is the decor going to cost. I think a more supportive question might be, what does it take to create this experience from start to finish? Because the same centerpiece or decor concept can vastly vary among different install times or venue access or production requirements or time of year. And so I think that what I really emphasize couples to consider or take into consideration when they're mapping out their financial investments, or they're trying to understand how much things are going to cost, is getting really intentional about what is the type of occasion that we want to host. Okay, so now what is it going to take in order to create that experience? And then looking at the full scale picture and saying, Are we $100,000 off our budget? Because if we're $100,000 off our budget, really the only variables that are going to come into play that are going to support to some extent is going to be the tier of property that you select, the number of people that you are inviting, or the meals that you are hosting, right? And the number of events that you're going to be having over the course of that weekend. Those are the direct variable costs because, quite frankly, y'all, there's only so much that you can pull from decor. There's only so much that you can pull from the vendor categories to a point that it starts to almost not really make sense. What's going to happen is you're going to, maybe polish those things down. And then after you sign the venue contract and you get to I call it the exciting phase, the more fun phase, right? Like, as budget analysis and venue contracting isn't exactly the most fun part of the planning journey. But once you get through that hurdle and you do get into the fun part, you don't want to basically be getting quotes from vendors and things to that end and constantly be being met with disappointment because, quite frankly, you've under budgeted what the market is calling for. And one of the things that we will be offering within our company is going to be, again, some like budget template downloads that I think are going to be super supportive for couples and giving them some like ranges, like low tier, mid tier, high tier in terms of vendor cost so that they can even like wrap their head around how much things in the market are costing right now. So that they can have more intentional conversations on the front end because, nobody's dogging anybody. You just don't know what you don't know. And without the resources and guidance and hopefully podcasts like this, it's difficult to be able to navigate those conversations. So I think that one of the most valuable things that a planner really provides is not simply helping you to spend less, right? It's helping you to understand where every dollar is going before you make any commitments. Because when you see that both the visible and invisible costs are merged together, you can make decisions more intentionally instead of reacting throughout the planning process, right? That's one of the biggest takeaways, I think, for any couple is that the most successful wedding budgets aren't built around guesswork. They're built around clarity. And when you understand both the visible and invisible costs from the beginning, you're able to invest where it matters most and avoid surprises along the way. So if you're beginning your planning journey, and quite frankly, you just want a realistic framework before you're making decisions. That's exactly the kind of guidance that my team provides because confidence doesn't come from spending more. It just comes from understanding what you're planning for. And if you're interested, I will definitely be linking soon on our social media channel. They're not ready yet, but I will be linking to our Stand store where you can download some really supportive guide and templates to help you to navigate this conversation a little bit further.